Hi, welcome to another episode of the Whole Note podcast. I'm your host, Shin Kim, and I'm so excited to be joined today by cellist Nathan Chan. Nathan is currently the assistant principal cellist of the Seattle Symphony and also sustains a massive presence on social media, having garnered over 35 million views across his many different accounts. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Shin for having me. This is going to be a blast. We can nerd out a little bit.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'm really excited to pick your brain about the cello, amongst other things. So Nathan, first off, um I've known about you from a distance for a while, just through your incredible videos on YouTube and Instagram, and I've been so marveled at your playing. And something that I notice, whether it's your performance videos or your different content that you have come to create, is in everything you do, you exude such a sense of joy and passion for everything. And it's funny because there's a video on YouTube that went viral several years ago, but it's still up there. So for our listeners, please go check it out. It's a video of you at 2 years old conducting Mahler 2, which it's so adorable. And but even at that young age, you had this sense of joy and passion for music. Can you talk a little bit about where that came from and how you were able to foster such love and joy at such a young age?
Oh, well, firstly, thank you for your extremely kind words and deep dive of some of those old videos. It's definitely kind of feels like the archives now, but um, it is something that I think about often where this joy and passion came from. And I have to say that it really comes from a very innate and organic place within my very soul and body. Um, I feel music is one of our most powerful languages as a human species, and there is a universality of how it can affect us as souls, really. And I think that's something I experienced very fortunately at a very young age through symphonic music primarily. I think that was my really first exposure to classical music, if you will. And I think the breadth and scope of what's available in symphonic repertoire uh, in terms of the instrumentation, the largeness and the grandeur of a large symphonic work has affected me uh, from a very young age. And um, I think also I have to thank my parents for really encouraging me to be expressive in and not really uh, put any obstacles on that type of expression from me at a very young age, and encouraged me and nurtured and recognized that passion. And I'm sure there's some, if you want to be super uh, psychological about it, some sort of reaffirming cyclical nature that, seeing some sort of notion of expression and passion in me and having positive reinforcement allowed me to recognize that in myself, that that's something that's accepted and loved and nurtured and encouraged by external forces as well. So I have to really thank my parents for encouraging that. But uh, it ultimately comes from a very natural phenomenon of music and the effect it has on us as human beings.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really deep. And I mean, before we started recording, we were talking about the Dvorak Concerto, and I mean, I think a a big reason why that piece is so well loved and treasured, amongst many reasons, is um, it really, uh, as a listener, it kind of takes you on this journey, but it helps you reflect on different points in life, I think.
Absolutely.
Especially because this was obviously at a time in Dvorak's life where he was struggling, and he was obviously very homesick. So I
Hmm.
think a lot of different life values kind of come out of a piece like Dvorak, and obviously many other works. Obviously, the great Tchaikovsky symphonies and Beethoven symphonies. So, um, okay, yeah, no, that's great. I'm wondering. So, when did you come to the cello then? Was it soon
Hmm.
after you were introduced to symphonic works, or?
Yeah, I would say um, after a small stint in conducting at a young age, my parents were curious to see how that would manifest in a more tangible manifestation of music, one could say.
Right.
And so I actually was really initially drawn to the double bass. And
Mm,
there's a moment in Beethoven 5 where there's two long, I believe, quarter notes, dum bum, in the first movement of Beethoven 5. And I remember watching a video with the Berlin Philharmonic and Herbert von Karajan and seeing those instruments lined up in this very cinematic way,
yeah.
and being extremely drawn to the sound, the visual
Right.
aspect of the double bass. And so I had let my parents know that I wanted to play the double bass at first, but they were very wise. I was a very small child, and I still am not the largest person on the planet. And so they said, we better take it down a notch, and we settled on the cello. And I remember actually, just to test this theory, my mother had brought me to a group violin class to see if this was just some little kid naivete. But I was very against the sound of the violin. So I apologize to all you violinists out there, but it's true that I think the cello sounds far better.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I know that you studied with the late great Irene Sharp out in the Bay Area. Can you talk a little bit about how she helped foster your love, more specifically to the cello?
Absolutely. Um, Irene Sharp was one of my very first mentors in cello, and she shaped so much of my knowledge of cello repertoire, also fostered the regularity of performing works on a scheduled basis, which I'll talk a little bit more about later.
Mhm.
But I think first and foremost, my impression of Irene Sharp was she was such a figurehead in the Bay Area growing up. She was the cello teacher,
Right.
and it was an immense honor to really study with her and work with her, and also get exposed to some wonderful cello playing by peers of mine in the Bay Area, as we all sort of went through this very structured style of teaching of hers where uh, every month we would have the studio class, and we were sort of expected to perform a new piece every month.
Mhm.
And that was just a regular thing. Um, and I am so appreciative of that because I think that uh, first of all, exposed me to a lot of repertoire, but also got us to this kind of schedule of getting a piece ready in what would be considered a fairly short amount of time, I think, by today's standard. I think now 1 month seems like no time at all to learn a new piece,
Mhm.
but just that speed of getting it to a very high level um, allowed me, I think, to I think in today's world, I would consider myself a pretty fast learner of music, and I have to attribute it to her probably because of that.
Mhm.
But she was an immense teacher, and I studied with her for over 13 years
Oh,
growing up, which
wow.
is very unusual.
Mm.
Um, I know typically you would change teachers much more frequently than that, but I think that's kind of the immense power that she had as a teacher, that she could really build you up really from ground zero to, a very high level. So I miss her dearly, and she was one of my great mentors.
Yeah, that's really sweet. And kind of moving on to life after the Bay Area. So you went on to go study at Columbia and Juilliard, which it still kind of blows my mind how people do that. I mean, because I know NEC and Harvard are the only other schools, as far as I'm aware, that have this dual program. And you earned your bachelor's in economics at Columbia and your master's at Juilliard in cello.
That's right.
Um, so can you talk a little bit about how you juggled both endeavors, and also how did your work at Columbia fuel your work as a cellist, if at all, and vice versa?
That's a great question. I'm very uh, proud to say that I did the Columbia Juilliard program. I think in hindsight, it was one of the best decisions of my life. And I remember at the time going into it, I had a lot of questions from folks about, why aren't you just going straight into music school? And, is this some sort of a backup plan or whatnot?
Mhm,
And I think it was a combination of lots of things. First of all, being uh, very heavily invested into academics growing up.
mhm,
Even though cello was a big part of my life, I think my family's values were such that, you still have to do great work in school. And I think always maintaining these dual sides of my life, um, while sometimes it made it difficult to really put in lots and lots of hours in the cello.
mhm,
I think it made me a hopefully a more well-rounded person in terms of really thinking about music and life in general from as many perspectives as possible.
mhm,
And so I know when I was at college in the program, the very first thing uh, that made an impression on me is that the people around me, they're as good as at what they do as what I do in the cello. I mean, they
mhm.
started very young,
Yeah.
becoming scientists or biologists or some of the math, these people that were just geniuses at math.
Mhm.
uh, it was very humbling,
Yeah.
to say the least. And so I think in my sophomore year, I kind of made this realization that, wow, the passion that these people have in what they're doing at Columbia is what I have in the cello. And so I started around sophomore year shifting my focus back into cello.
Mhm,
Maybe also naivete, thinking in college maybe I would pursue something else. I wasn't
mhm,
100% committed to the cello at that stage.
mhm.
But that time there made me realize that cello is really, I think, what I was meant to do on this earth.
Right.
Um, let's see. What was the other part of your question? I'm forgetting.
Oh, just yeah, how your work at Columbia fueled your work on the cello and vice versa. So
Oh, right.
yeah.
Um, from a very practical point of view, uh, ch- I think I had to become extremely efficient in my practice. um, um, I think that's when I started uh, becoming on team night practice, hashtag team night practice.
Yeah.
Uh, I know a lot of people like to get up early and, pump in a couple hours before breakfast. That is not me at all. I value those hours
Yeah.
greatly, and
Yeah.
my REM sleep is in full blast in the morning.
Right.
And so, even now, sometimes my best practice is after a concert, just getting into a practice room and just really putting in a couple hours until 1 or 2 in the morning. So, that was one thing that Columbia taught me. Another thing is, let's see, I think it was Pablo Casals that said that you're a human being first, then an artist, then a cellist.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great perspective to have on all people and uh, points of interest in life.
Mhm.
Um, the cello is a very sacred thing, of course,
Right.
to all of us musicians. But if you zoom out a little bit, it's really the act of communication
Yeah.
and then really about connecting with other humans. And
Right.
so I think being at Columbia really enforced that you can't directly talk to somebody about uh, music theory or how smooth bow changes are, but you talk about, oh, when I want to make transitionary material,
Yeah.
how do I connect concepts together in a very
Mhm.
smooth fashion?
Mhm.
That's something that everybody can understand.
Right.
And I think coming from coming from that perspective as a musician is really wonderful, because it kind of forces you to zoom out, and I think it ultimately makes you a better communicator on the instrument when you think about just how diverse an audience can be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I love that you brought up the Casals quote and also just talking about how it kind of forced you to broaden your horizon because I think as musicians, it's very intrinsic. It's very much a necessity for us to kind of zoom out and
Yes.
experience life outside of music and then bring what we experience back into music. And, you know, I think there's a point in all of our lives where we need to spend 5, 6 hours in the practice room regularly, of course, for our development.
Right.
But I think if you sustain that for an extended period of time, then your music starts to get almost a little stale because I mean, I
Mhm.
think you've obviously probably experienced that yourself where you've probably seen colleagues perform and you're blown away by their accuracy and their proficiency, but you can tell that they just spent a lot of time in the practice room. And I mean, again, everyone has a different method in approaching music, but I think when you just kind of lock yourself in a room and practice for that long, then you almost start to kind of lose the value and the reason for music, I think. And so,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and so I'm really glad that you brought up that point about zooming out a little bit and
Mhm.
living life. Yeah.
Yeah. It's always been a difficult struggle for me because, uh, you know, there are similar to what you're saying about you can see people who've practiced a lot, but maybe haven't had those life experiences. I feel also you can tell people that have lots of life experience but just haven't put in the put in the hours, and it's very frustrating
Yeah,
because they
yeah,
could be so great. So
yeah.
it, I always am thinking about this, and in a way, because maybe I didn't have all those hours to begin with uh, in that stage, sometimes I feel like I'm catching up
Mhm.
technically to meet myself musically. Actually, maybe as a general rule, I've always felt musicality has come more easily to me. And so the
Sure.
part I really work on personally is trying to maintain and enhance my technique because that doesn't come as easily to me. And I always wonder what happens if I really was practicing like crazy. Maybe I could be an even greater cellist today.
Uh,
Such is life.
yeah, so yeah, exactly. Yeah, and continuing our discussion of your work at Juilliard, you studied at Juilliard with one of the premier cello teachers, not just in the country, but really in the world, and Richard Aaron. Can you talk a little bit about how you first came to work with him and also how your work together has shaped your view and your work as a cellist and musician today?
Sure. Oh, Richard, my dear friend Richard. I first was introduced to Richard perhaps by the legacy of his pedagogy and his students, in that I heard the great cellist David Ricciero,
Yeah.
who is, I believe, a professor in, I think it's Denver, Colorado.
Colorado Boulder.
Boulder,
Yeah,
Colorado.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah.
And the reason I heard him is because he had just recently won the Klein competition,
Hmm.
and mm, they perform with the Great Peninsula Symphony in the Bay Area. And
Oh.
uh, actually, as a little fun fact, my father, who's an amateur violinist, was
Mhm.
a member of that symphony. So every year I would go
Oh.
hear the Klein competition winners.
Mhm.
And I remember seeing David Ricciero's right hand. And
Yeah,
this was something that was always a weakness of mine. And just the way he pulled the bow
yeah,
on the right hand, and just the beauty of the mechanic of the arm. I was
right.
like, I want that bow arm. And
Yeah.
then, of course, reading his background, I saw he studied with this man named Richard Aaron. And so um, uh, I was very lucky to get connected with him, and he invited me one summer to join him in Aspen
Mhm.
and take some lessons with him. And the very first time I met him, he gave a master class.
Mhm.
And Richard Aaron is one of the finest master class givers of all time,
Mhm.
in my opinion.
Mhm.
Um, he's able to recognize a technical weakness in a very nice way, in a student, and he has a very direct and applicable tool in which to correct that weakness.
Mhm.
And so uh, it was very a wonderful summer, and eventually that led to a relationship that allowed me to study with him at Juilliard, and I'm so thankful because, kind of alluding to the past where I always felt my technique had to catch up with my musicality, he was the perfect teacher for me
Mhm.
because of his ability to give musicians a set of tools.
Yeah.
It really feels like when you study with Richard, he's giving you a toolbox
Mhm.
and a system to recognize your own weaknesses,
Mhm.
and then you can really fix them yourself.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the big leaps in progression from a student cellist to a semi-professional and a professional is teaching somebody how to practice.
Right.
Um, at least from my perspective, I never really had uh, the clearest goals in the practice room, and Richard really gave me that toolbox in
Mhm.
which to enhance my playing, and for that I'm eternally grateful.
Mhm.
And he really just he fixed me up. I was a
Mhm.
broken car. I went into his workshop, and he just tuned me up
Yeah.
real good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he really is like the closest thing to like a cello doctor where I
Yeah,
think is
yeah,
he just you go see him and he knows what to do. So
absolutely.
yeah, so
Have you had a chance to work with him, or?
no, unfortunately, it's been a dream to play for him, but he came to Indiana a few years back, and this was right before the pandemic, and he gave a master class. So I didn't play, but yeah, I got to observe and just see his incredible teaching. So yeah, and it's kind of for you at least coming full circle because recently it was announced that he was going to be teaching at the San Francisco Conservatory, so he'll be kind of back in your
That's
old
right.
stomping grounds. So
I know, I know.
yeah,
I'm really happy to hear that, and
yeah.
it was. I think it's definitely a big surprise for a lot of us, but I think
Yeah,
a very exciting development.
right.
Um, I guess my history with the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, I did their pre-college program,
Mm,
and it's just grown into this. At least from what it seems to me, it's like they're making a lot of moves to become a significant player in the space.
right,
um where they purchased Opus 3,
right.
and then making these big moves, and now they have Richard. And so
Yeah.
if I was a betting man,
Mhm.
and music organizations were stocks,
Mm.
I would buy a lot of stock in SFPM right now.
It's it's a great
Coming
way to.
from a man with an economics
That's
degree, right?
right. And I'm glad you also brought up David Ricuro. He is an incredible cellist. Like, honestly,
Amazing.
in many ways, very underrated and underappreciated, I would say, because he's very low profile, which I respect, obviously.
Yeah.
But I played for him before he got the Colorado job. He like randomly came to Oklahoma one with his. He was with a piano trio, uh and his trio came, and we played in a little. I played in a little master class for him, and he is honestly, I feel like in many ways a direct reflection of Richard Aaron and just
Yeah.
the way he talks about the cello. Um,
He's a
so
very thoughtful guy, great
yeah,
musician,
very yeah,
very, very sung quality to his playing, and
mm,
phrasing is impeccable.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. And so going on and talking now a little bit about your day job. So
Sure.
you're currently serving as the assistant principal cellist of the Seattle Symphony, one of the major orchestras in America. Can you talk a little bit about your role as the assistant principal cellist and the challenges that come with holding such a high chair?
Oh, well, that's very, very elevated to speaking. I just feel like it's a privilege to be a part of a team of wonderful musicians working towards a unified goal in terms of what it means to be in an orchestra. And I feel so appreciative of this opportunity to be um, assistant principal um, uh, over my several years being here in Seattle. It's given me so many wonderful opportunities. Um, it's, I will say, uh, uh, one of the most humbling, and I think ultimately good. It was great for me, but at the time it was very difficult. Is the orchestral audition process.
Yeah.
And as someone who has always prioritized,
Mm.
communication and telling a story in my cello playing, um, transferring that type of mindset to an orchestral audition where you have to be extremely polished
Yeah.
and clean was a whole journey in and of itself.
Yeah.
Um, and so it was a very humbling experience. I would say I've never practiced as much in my life as uh, those those months and years of preparation for orchestral auditions. And ultimately, even though that upfront work is so difficult, I think being in the orchestra is ultimately a very freeing proposition. It's given me, of course, great financial freedom, which I'm very appreciative of.
Right.
And I guess as a backstory, my primary reason for going into the orchestral world was, Richard and I had a very serious talk, I think, heading into my second year master's.
Mm.
And he just said, so what do you want to do after this? Like,
Mm.
do you want to do more school? Or what do you want to do? And you know, I was pretty schooled out, I would say, and I was ready to get life started. And so
Yeah.
I said,
Yeah.
I don't really want to do any more school. And he said, okay, well, we better start preparing your orchestral auditions. And I was like,
Mm.
oh, and it kind of felt like, brushing your teeth and flossing your teeth every day. And but Richard really guided me through the process of what that was like, and it really paid dividends almost immediately. Taking those first couple of auditions, not knowing what to expect, but still getting quite far in the process, and
Sure.
in a way, naivete, just keep going. And eventually I was very fortunate enough to win a job in a city that I really love, and in a way, it allowed me to come back home to the West Coast.
Right.
And so, I guess my advice for everybody out there is, uh, hopefully, don't see if you're pursuing an orchestral job, don't see it as the end, but simply the beginning to a a life of continued growth in music, and continue searching for, uh, you know, ways to express yourself. Um, Orchestra teaches you so much, uh, in terms of course, learning great repertoire. And actually, what I've been loving is having a really objective perspective, hopefully, on conducting. You
Mm,
know, when I when I'm playing and I'm observing, you know, wonderful leaders at the podium, or sometimes, you know, people that, something is missing. Being able to observe what makes a great conductor great, and how they rehearse.
right.
I think that's been an incredible skill to observe.
Yeah. Yeah. And just quickly touching back on the orchestral audition process,
Mm,
I think it was with Will Hagen in a previous episode where we talked about how, or he was saying how he believes that orchestra auditions are way more difficult than international competitions. And it's in many ways, I think it's true because with orchestra auditions, you just get they just get a snapshot of your playing. You get anywhere from 30 seconds to maybe 2 minutes to play little bits of pieces as opposed to competitions where you obviously get to play full pieces. So
mm.
um, I'm sure you had to kind of work on just kind of getting in that mindset like right away because you have almost no time to to relax. So,
Definitely. I
yeah.
think there's a whole mental game, uh, in 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 that kind of confinement of, you got to be, ready to go, and that takes time
Yeah.
and experience, and a lot of playing for others,
Mm.
because there's no getting around that, scariness of, it feels like you're ripping off all your clothes and you're just butt naked in front of in front of people that you really, really respect.
Right.
Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I can't speak to international auditions, and Will Hagen is a dear friend of mine, and
Mhm.
uh, incredible player.
Yeah.
He incredible musicianship, and
Right.
um, uh, I guess, where am I going with this? I mm, I guess it's part of my personality, but I've never enjoyed the competitive aspect
Sure.
of being in this field. Uh, and I think, in a way, that's why one of my huge love is chamber music.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
it's I love this aspect of making other people look good, on a stage, and I think
Mm.
that's something that also comes to play when you're in an orchestra.
Yeah.
I want people to feel happy.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah.
the way I am. I don't like to go, oh, look how, you know. And
Yeah.
of course, you need a little bit of. I think in this industry, you need a healthy amount of ego.
Mhm.
Um, but I've also, over the years, seen how big of a detriment ego can come into play in this industry, and
Yeah.
ultimately it can be the downfall of many a great musician.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's maybe, I guess, speaking to your question about international auditions, orchestral auditions, managing ego in terms of, you want to feel very proud of the work you've done on your instrument for
Yeah.
this 10-minute moment,
Mm.
but also to have the humility and the humbleness to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
as a in terms of your sound, in terms of your suppleness. And I don't know if they're doing this much more these days. I haven't. you know, been successful in auditions recently, but
Mm,
sometimes getting a comment from behind the screen, can you
mm,
modify this?
mm,
Can
mm.
you change this? And I think you need to tame your ego and say, "Oh yeah, of course, I'd love to try that."
Yeah,
Um, so I don't know, just some random thoughts in my
yeah,
head
yeah.
of the difficulties of all of that.
Well, yeah, and digging a little deeper into your work specifically with the orchestra, um, I talked with Austin Huntington in the last episode, and he's the principal cellist, obviously, of Indianapolis Symphony. And in a way, I almost feel like your job is a little less enviable because you're you can go from being in the section to one week to having to lead the section another week. Can you talk a little bit about the preparation for that? And also, do you know at the beginning of a season when the principal cellist takes off certain weeks and that you're having to lead, or can you just dive into a little bit of that?
It's definitely one of the more unique aspects of the assistant principal, and frankly, any type of associate or assistant principal position.
Mhm,
I would say, I would argue that musically, when you're in your proper spot, and for
mhm,
me, assistant principal in Seattle Symphony, I know it's different everywhere.
mhm.
It's third chair, so basically, I sit right behind the principal, our
Sure.
wonderful principal F.A. Baltajigil.
Mhm.
Um, uh, I actually kind of like sitting there in a typical week because, in a way, I don't have the what? How do I explain this? I don't have the uh, directed. Uh, how do I explain this? I can be free without the guilt.
Oh.
Maybe that's one way to put it.
Yeah.
So I can somewhat, play more freely.
Mhm,
Um, uh, but definitely, for example, this week we're playing Dvorak Cello Concerto and Rachmaninoff Symphony Number Two,
mhm,
two of the great pieces in the repertoire.
mhm.
And unfortunately, our principal got sick, and so our associate principal Mika Kwan de Lorenzo, with less than 12 hours notice, had to step up and play principal.
Oh, wow.
And uh, the level of preparation when you're the principal is definitely must be extremely high.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, the unique thing about the Seattle Symphony is we also play the opera.
Mhm.
So 4 or 5 times throughout the year, the orchestra will split into two groups, and half of us continue playing in the symphony, and half of us continue playing in the opera for a couple weeks.
Oh,
And
wow.
so oftentimes I find myself playing principal for the opera,
Mhm.
and it's a I kind of enjoy being able to step up and step back, and it gives me a chance to um, play that leadership role. Um, One of the other things I like playing principal of the opera that's different than in the symphony is, oftentimes we'll have maybe 3 concerts a week and then the program is done. Well,
Mhm.
opera, because there's so much time and resources, will often play 6, 7 shows
You're
of
right.
the same work. And while some people might find that repetitive, I actually find that quite rewarding in that, especially from a principal position,
Mhm.
every show I try and analyze what went well and what didn't, and I have more opportunities to improve myself over the subsequent shows
Mm,
in all aspects of in all all aspects of improvement. So
sure.
knowledge of the score, leadership style, um, sound.
Mm,
It's an interesting little internal journey that one can go through, but definitely when you're a principal of a major symphony, and I'm sure Austin told you this, the
mm,
the the level of knowledge of the music and also the interpersonal kind of role
mm.
of making everybody feel comfortable
Yeah.
is an aspect that I feel, unless you're in an intense orchestral training program
Mm.
before school, is something I've had to learn on the job.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's been a very interesting experience, but I definitely am feeling more and more comfortable with that, and
Mhm.
it's something I like about being an assistant principal.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, Austin did mention one time early in his career, he gave a comment to someone in the section, and it was probably a little bit more direct than it needed to be. And so he was saying that he had to learn how to communicate, like what you were saying. And I mean, yeah, because as a principal, you um, obviously you delegate, but also it's a lot of it is just very, uh, uh, I would say, just, embodying the section and like kind of really showing the gestures well, which I'm sure you've come to really learn to do well. Um, so now talking a little bit about your life outside of your day job,
Sure.
of which I admire so much greatly, just how multifaceted you are in your life in music. So you have quite a following on your various social media accounts. You're on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. And like I mentioned before, you've garnered over 35 million. It's probably more now, but on your bio it said 35 million views. Um, and so, can you talk a little bit about how, like your origin story of how you came to start your passion, expressing music through this medium, and how also do you come up with these different ideas, especially for the videos that are more focused on entertainment?
Sure, sure. Um, in terms of my origin story, uh, I think I have to go back to like those conducting days when I was 2 or 3. And something that's unique about, I guess, our generation is that we grew up with technology really making rapid change
Yeah,
in our lives, like kind of unheard of, you know. Maybe the generation before us, it was recordings that really revolutionized classical music, being able to hear, go to the library and
mm,
pick out a favorite recording. And then our generation is the introduction of video
mhm,
along with that recording. And I think experiencing that created a perfect storm of 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 experiencing classical music in this very unique way of not only admiring sound but also kind of the artistry of what a person is physically doing in order to create that sound.
yeah,
And so, our generation growing up now, we have the internet, which is really cool, I
yeah,
think. Um, and uh, my journey with social media initially started simply with posting some old concert footage. Like, growing up, my parents would video some random things that I would do, and I
sure,
think I just posted some of that stuff. And that was fine, but it wasn't until the realization that I myself, as the artist, could create those
mhm,
videos with, you know, either a combination of, you know, my very first movie editor,
mhm,
iMovie,
mhm.
on the Mac. Loved. It was like, wow, I can, wow, look at all these cool things. I can film this, and then it's on here, and
Yeah, right.
it was really cool. And I remember in youth orchestra, I teamed up with a good friend of mine, Alex Fager, and we created this Super Mario Brothers duet for cello and violin. And one could argue that was my first foray into classical and pop coming together.
Mhm,
And it did really well, and it was fun. And all of a sudden, this whole new door opened up to me where I didn't necessarily have to play the music that my teachers wanted me to play. And that was awesome
mhm.
and freeing and exciting and allowed me to, in a way, connect with my peers in a different way.
Right.
You can tell them you're playing Squire Tarantella, and they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah." Or you can tell them, check out Super Mario Brothers. And, whoa, this is super cool.
Yeah.
And I think that really lit a fire in me. And so I became very interested in movie editing. And so
Hmm.
in high school, I took a little film course. And then
Hmm.
in college, took a little audio editing course and
Hmm.
just continuously posting. And
Yeah.
um, in college, I was part of this really fun cello ensemble where I kind of five-person cello ensemble called String Theory, where we
Oh.
created our own arrangements of pop music and
Mm.
played it on the cello, and that was super fun and allowed us to connect with our colleagues and friends on campus and
Mhm.
play concerts at
Mhm.
Columbia that were super, honestly, some of my favorite moments of my career.
Mhm.
Um, and where am I going with this? I guess. Uh, oh yeah. So on the question of the more entertaining bits of content, um, I think it comes from a um a deep seated uh uh feeling that I want to explain what all of this is about
Mm.
to anybody.
Yeah.
Um, I feel if we can connect with people either through humor or education or just an overall feeling of positivity about what we do in classical music, then that's a big win for all of us.
Yeah.
And so, oh, look at thumbs ups. That's interesting. I've never seen that before. And so that's where some of my more entertaining content comes from.
Mm.
And, you know, they're incredible content creators that are focused on this. Of course, Two Set Violin is my
Yeah.
favorite. And they've really connected with musicians all over. And there's a universality of of relating to, I think, growing up and learning music and some of the strange things that we all accept to be true, but maybe aren't necessarily should be true,
Yeah.
and questioning the status quo. And that's what I like about Two Set is
Mm.
that yes, they're funny, but they're also challenging the status quo.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I relate to, especially um, as well. So
Yeah.
I guess that's sort of my origin story. And you know, I've had, ups and downs with content creation as well. I guess uh, as a shortened version during the pandemic, I kind of went from the stage where, oh, I can finally create as much as I ever wanted. And then it kind of burned me out a little bit. And I was like,
Mm.
oh, I only want to create what I really want to create. And then afterwards, I was like, oh, I need to take a break from this.
Mm. Mm.
And
Yeah.
so only in the past couple of years have I started easing my way back into content creation
Yeah.
because I think it can also be dangerous,
Right.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Everything in moderation, I think.
Right. Well, and I love your passion for wanting to make music and cello more accessible to the greater audience because I think one of our greatest heroes as cellists, Yo-Yo Ma, was really kind of the greatest torch bearer in that regard because I mean obviously he came up before social media, but even then like he was going on shows like Arthur and Sesame Street and all these children's shows and he welcomed a whole new audience of people to music that otherwise might not have had an opportunity to even know what a cello is. So, I mean, I think that's a really beautiful thing what you're doing with social media because again, I mean, with, all the talk about, well, like what's the point of going to an orchestra concert or like the downhill of classical music? I think as musicians, it's not just our jobs to perform at the highest level anymore. It's to really um, create value and to show it's the value and the beauty of music to as many people as possible. So Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing these podcasts. You're doing your part too. Don't forget that.
No, I love talking to people, and I love just the interpersonality person interpersonal aspects of these discussions. So I always feel like I'm learning. So thank you for taking part. So
Thank you. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. So no, Nathan, thank you so much for everything today. I feel like I've gained so much in the short time. Before we go, do you have any final words of wisdom that you would like to share with our audience, more specifically to younger musicians that may be listening, and give any words of wisdom to them on this?
Hmm. I think young people today learning music, I encourage you to explore as much of the world as possible. Um, I guess it depends on where you're coming from in terms of your relationship to music, and understanding the motivation for why you're doing what you're doing is one of the most important things that you can discover as a musician. And once you recognize that, developing your life story so that you can feed off that eternal impulse, I think is what's going to keep you going and help you endure the natural challenges that you will encounter along this way. So learn to really find out what makes you tick and feed that energy.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Nathan, for your time. You're such a busy man, and you're obviously in demand everywhere. So thank you for giving us this time, and thank you for everything.